At 09:47 hours on February 25, 1945, the main battery plotting room aboard USS Missouri hummed with electronic activity as the battleship steamed toward Iwo Jima. Fire control technicians called out ranges and bearings. Green phosphorescent traces swept across radar screens, painting the positions of every ship in Task Force 58. The men in that plotting room knew something most Americans would never understand. The ship they were serving on, the one that would become the most famous battleship in American history, had the weakest combat record of any modern battleship in the fleet. Missouri was superbly built with a well-trained crew. But combat effectiveness isn't measured by potential. It's measured by what a ship accomplishes when the shooting starts. And by that measure, Missouri was far behind her sisters. USS Missouri was massive, 45,000 tons fully loaded, 887 feet 3 inches from bow to stern, 108 feet 2 inches wide. 9 16-inch Mark 7 guns mounted in 3 triple turrets could hurl a 2,700-pound armor-piercing shell 24 miles with enough energy to penetrate 20 feet of reinforced concrete or 16 inches of steel armor plate. Her secondary battery included 25-inch 38-caliber dual-purpose guns in 10 twin mounts, 80 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns in 20 quad mounts, 49 20mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft cannon. More than 150 guns total. Her armor was equally formidable. 12-inch thick steel belt at the waterline, 17-inch thick turret faceplates. The armor system was designed to withstand 18-inch shells from Japanese super battleships. Her fire control systems used the most advanced radar in the world. Mark 8 fire control radar could track surface targets beyond the horizon at ranges exceeding 40,000 yards. The analog, computers in the plotting room could calculate firing solutions faster and more accurately than any human crew. Missouri could engage targets the enemy couldn't even see yet. She looked unstoppable, the ultimate expression of naval engineering. And in 1992, when she fired her last rounds in the Persian Gulf, military magazines would call her the greatest battleship of World War II. Naval historians writing for popular audiences would rank her number 1. The Navy would preserve her as a museum ship in Pearl Harbor, 500 yards from USS Arizona, to symbolize both the beginning and end of America's Pacific War. But the truth that impressive statistics concealed was stark. Missouri had never sunk an enemy warship, never engaged another battleship in surface combat, never fought a gun duel, never fired her main battery at a ship that could shoot back, never participated in a fleet action. She had arrived too late for the major naval battles that defined the Pacific War, too late for the desperate carrier actions of 1942 and 1943 when the outcome of the war hung in the balance. Too late for the surface engagements at Guadalcanal, where American battleships fought Japanese battleships in point-blank night actions. Too late for the Philippine Sea, where American carriers destroyed Japanese naval aviation. Too late for Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, the last time battleships traded salvos at gun range. Missouri missed everything that made a battleship's reputation. Everything that tested whether a ship and crew could perform under ultimate pressure against an enemy trying to kill them. Her powerful guns, her advanced radar, her heavy armor, none of it had been truly tested against an enemy who could fight back with equal weapons. Missouri's combat experience was shore bombardment and anti-aircraft duty, essential roles, vital to the island-hopping campaign, but not what battleships were designed to do. Not what separated the great battleships from merely adequate ones. The Iowa-class battleships were supposed to be the Navy's answer to Japan's super battleships. Intelligence reports suggested Japan was building the Yamato class. Ships displacing 70,000 tons with 18-inch guns that could destroy any existing American battleship in a gun duel. The Navy needed battleships fast enough to catch Japanese carriers while powerful enough to stand in the battle line against the largest warships afloat. The Iowa-class design was revolutionary for American battleship construction. 33 knots maximum speed. Faster than any previous American battleship by at least 5 knots. fast enough to keep station with the Essex-class fleet carriers that were transforming naval warfare. The speed came from massive propulsion plants, 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, 4 General Electric steam turbines generating 212,000 shaft horsepower, 4 propeller shafts, each shaft turning a 17-foot diameter bronze propeller. The armor scheme was equally sophisticated. The belt armor was inclined internally at 19 degrees to increase effective thickness without adding weight. The armored deck was designed to detonate shells that plunged through the belt from long range. The underwater protection system used multiple bulkheads and void spaces to absorb torpedo explosions. The design could theoretically survive 3 or 4 torpedo hits and remain combat capable. The fire control systems were better than anything afloat, better than German systems, better than British systems, certainly better than Japanese systems. American naval radar in 1944 was 2 years ahead of everyone else. The Mark 8 radar could track targets at 40,000 yards in any weather. Japanese rangefinders were useless beyond 20,000 yards. American battleships could hit targets the enemy couldn't see. But by the time Missouri was commissioned in June 1944, the war had changed. Aircraft carriers had made battleships obsolete for strategic dominance. Control of the sea no longer came from battleship fleets slugging it out in massive gun duels. It came from carrier task forces launching airstrikes hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. The great surface battles were over. Leyte Gulf in October 1944 would be the last battleship engagement in history. Missouri missed it by 3 months. The delay wasn't Missouri's fault. Construction took time. The keel was laid in January 1941 at Brooklyn Navy Yard. The hull was launched in January 1944. Fitting out and trials took another 5 months. Missouri was commissioned on June 11, 1944. She spent summer and fall training the crew, testing systems. She didn't leave for the Pacific until November. By the time she arrived in combat waters in January 1945, the Japanese Navy was a spent force. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers at Midway in June 1942 in 1 day of catastrophic combat. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the heart of Japan's carrier striking force, went to the bottom along with their irreplaceable veteran pilots and air crews. 3 more carriers were destroyed at the Philippine Sea in June 1944 during what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The rest of the carrier force was destroyed at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, where Japan committed nearly everything that could still float in a desperate bid to destroy the American invasion fleet. By January 1945, the Japanese had maybe 100 operational carrier aircraft left scattered across the home islands. No experienced pilots remained. Most of the veterans had died over the preceding 3 years. The new pilots had minimal training. No fuel existed for proper instruction. Japan was reduced to the kamikaze attacks because conventional tactics required skill levels the surviving pilots didn't possess. The Japanese battleship force was equally devastated. Kirishima sunk at Guadalcanal in November 1942 by USS Washington's radar-directed guns. Musashi, one of the 70,000-ton super battleships, sunk by carrier aircraft at Leyte Gulf after absorbing 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits in a demonstration of American air power. Yamato still afloat but trapped in Kure Naval Base with no fuel to sortie. Nagato damaged and immobilized. The Japanese combined fleet that had terrorized the Pacific in 1941 and 1942 no longer existed as a combat-capable force. By January 1945, when Missouri finally entered the combat zone, the Pacific War was effectively over from a naval perspective. American carrier task forces roamed Japanese home waters at will. The numerical superiority was overwhelming. Task Force 58 alone fielded 16 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers. Japan had no carriers left capable of launching offensive operations. Missouri arrived when there was nothing left to sink. The comparisons with other American battleships were stark. USS North Carolina, commissioned in April 1941, 3 years before Missouri, had earned 12 battle stars during World War II. 12 separate campaigns where she faced enemy action and contributed to American victories. She had screened carriers through every major Pacific campaign from Guadalcanal forward. She had shot down dozens of Japanese aircraft in nearly every engagement. In August 1942, at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, North Carolina shot down between 7 and 14 Japanese aircraft during an 8-minute attack on Task Force 61. The exact count was disputed because multiple ships were firing at the same targets, but North Carolina's gunners performed with extraordinary effectiveness under intense pressure. Her 5-inch guns, 40mm Bofors, and 20mm Oerlikons created a wall of steel that protected the carrier USS Enterprise from Japanese torpedo bombers and dive bombers. North Carolina took a torpedo from Submarine 119 on September 15, 1942. The torpedo blew a hole 32 feet wide by 18 feet high in her port side below the waterline. 5 men died in the blast. The explosion flooded multiple compartments and created a severe list. But North Carolina's damage control parties counter-flooded opposite compartments to restore balance, shored up bulkheads to prevent further flooding, and maintained 25 knots speed despite the massive damage. She steamed to Pearl Harbor for repairs under her own power, covering thousands of miles with a gaping hole in her hull. She returned to combat 3 months later, supported the Gilbert Islands invasion, the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. North Carolina was present at every major American offensive from mid-1942 to mid-1945, 38 months of continuous combat operations. She fired over 2,200 16-inch shells at enemy positions and ships. North Carolina had been at Guadalcanal when the outcome of the Pacific War was uncertain, when Japanese naval forces were superior, when every American ship was desperately needed to maintain the thin line between victory and defeat. USS Washington, North Carolina's sister ship, had accomplished what Missouri never would. She had sunk an enemy battleship in surface combat. The Japanese battleship Kirishima in November 1942, at the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, the only American battleship to sink an enemy battleship in a night surface action during the entire war. The engagement demonstrated everything the fast battleship concept was designed to achieve, though Washington was a North Carolina-class ship, not an Iowa-class. Washington's action report described the engagement in clinical detail. The battle occurred on the night of November 14 to 15, 1942. American forces were desperately trying to prevent Japanese battleships from bombarding Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. If the Japanese succeeded in destroying the airfield, American Marines on the island would be isolated and vulnerable. The Marines were barely holding their positions. Japanese naval superiority in the region was crushing American attempts to reinforce and resupply. Washington's radar detected Kirishima at 15,000 yards. The Japanese ship was invisible in the darkness. No moon, no stars. Tropical storm clouds blocked ambient light. Visual gunnery was impossible. Washington closed to 8,400 yards before opening fire at 23:16 hours. The first salvo from Washington's 9 16-inch guns straddled the target. Shells landing on both sides of pointed it, the enemy battleship. The second salvo hit directly. The third salvo hit. In approximately 7 minutes of firing, Washington launched 75 rounds of 16-inch shells and scored at least 9 direct hits on Kirishima. The armor-piercing shells, each weighing 2,700 pounds and traveling faster than the speed of sound, penetrated Kirishima's superstructure and detonated inside the ship. Kirishima's fire control system was destroyed in the first salvos. Her steering mechanism was damaged. Massive fires erupted throughout the superstructure as ammunition stores and fuel tanks ignited. The Japanese battleship attempted to return fire, but her guns couldn't find a target in the darkness. Japanese optical rangefinders and visual fire control were useless. Washington's radar gave the Americans an insurmountable advantage. Kirishima capsized and sank at 03:25 hours on November 15, off Savo Island, taking most of her crew with her. Washington proved that American radar fire control and crew training could defeat a Japanese battleship even at night when visual gunnery was impossible. The action validated the entire fast battleship concept. Ships with radar-controlled guns could dominate surface actions regardless of visibility conditions. But by the time Missouri arrived in the Pacific 2 years later, there were no more surface actions to dominate. USS Iowa, the lead ship of the class, had combat accomplishments Missouri would never match. Iowa had escorted President Franklin Roosevelt to the Tehran Conference in November 1943, carrying the president across the Atlantic to North Africa. The mission gave Iowa prestige and political significance beyond her combat role. But Iowa had legitimate combat credentials beyond presidential transport. In February 1944, Iowa's task force raided Truk Atoll, Japan's major naval base in the Caroline Islands. The operation was designed to neutralize Truk as a strategic threat before the invasion of the Mariana Islands. Truk was Japan's Pearl Harbor, a massive anchorage protecting dozens of warships, hundreds of aircraft, and critical supply facilities. American intelligence knew the base had to be destroyed before American forces could advance further into the Central Pacific. On February 17, 1944, during Operation Hailstone, Iowa engaged and sunk the Japanese light cruiser Katori. The cruiser was attempting to escape Truk Lagoon with other surviving Japanese ships when Iowa's Mark 8 radar detected her at 35,000 yards, approximately 20 miles away. At that range, Katori's lookouts couldn't even see the American battleship over the horizon. The curvature of the Earth concealed Iowa's massive silhouette. Iowa opened fire at ranges where Katori couldn't effectively return fire. The first salvo from Iowa's 9 16-inch guns straddled the target, shells landing on both sides of the cruiser and sending up massive columns of water. The second salvo hit directly. 16-inch armor-piercing shells traveling at 2,500 feet per second struck Katori amidships. The cruiser's thin armor, designed to protect against destroyer gunfire and shell fragments, offered no resistance against battleship rounds. The shells penetrated completely through the hull and detonated inside the ship. Katori exploded and began sinking immediately. Within 11 minutes, Katori had gone to the bottom of the Pacific. 315 Japanese officers and sailors died. There were no survivors. The water was too deep and the ship sank too fast for anyone to escape. It wasn't a major naval victory in the strategic sense. Katori was a light cruiser displacing less than 6,000 tons, not a battleship or carrier, but it was a surface action, a ship-to-ship engagement where Iowa's crew and systems performed exactly as designed. The engagement demonstrated Iowa's radar fire control, superiority, and the effectiveness of her main battery against moving targets. Iowa's guns could kill ships that couldn't even see where the shells were coming from. Missouri never had that opportunity. Never fired her main battery at a ship that could maneuver and return fire. USS New Jersey had the longest combat deployment of any Iowa-class battleship, 19 months in the Pacific theater. Over 400 days at sea, more time under combat conditions than any of her sisters. New Jersey screened carriers at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American carrier aircraft destroyed 300 Japanese planes in one day and eliminated Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. New Jersey's anti-aircraft batteries contributed to the victory, shooting down kamikazes and torpedo bombers that penetrated the combat air patrol. Her 5-inch guns created a defensive umbrella over the carriers. Her radar, directed fire control made her anti-aircraft batteries far more effective than visually aimed weapons. She bombarded Guam, Saipan, Tinian during the Mariana Islands campaign, preparing landing beaches for marine assaults. Her 16-inch guns destroyed concrete bunkers, coastal artillery positions, and troop concentrations that would have slaughtered Marines during the initial assault waves. She bombarded Iwo Jima repeatedly during the preparatory phase before the invasion. Her guns destroyed Japanese fortifications on Mount Suribachi and throughout the island's defensive network. She bombarded Okinawa during the longest and bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. She fired her 16-inch guns at the Japanese home islands themselves during the final months of the war, destroying industrial targets and military facilities on Japanese soil. New Jersey earned 9 battle stars for World War II service. Missouri earned 3. The disparity told the story clearly. New Jersey fought from mid-1943 to war's end, participating in every major carrier operation and amphibious assault in the Central Pacific. Missouri fought for 8 months, arriving after the critical battles were over and Japan was already defeated. Missouri arrived in the Pacific in January 1945. The war was almost over. Japan's navy was destroyed. The carriers were sunk. The battleships were hiding in port with no fuel. American submarines had sunk most of Japan's merchant fleet, strangling the island nation's ability to import oil, raw materials, and food. B-29 bombers flying from the Marianas were burning Japanese cities with incendiary raids that killed tens of thousands of civilians. The outcome was inevitable. Japan had lost the war. Only the final surrender remained. There was nothing left for Missouri to fight. No enemy battle fleet to engage, no carriers to sink. The only naval combat left was defensive, protecting American carriers from kamikaze attacks, bombarding shore targets in preparation for invasions. Essential work, but not the work that made battleship legends or tested whether a ship and crew could perform under maximum pressure against an equivalent opponent. Missouri spent March 1945 operating with Task Force 58 off the Japanese home islands, the first time American carrier task forces had operated so close to Japan. The risks were extraordinary. Japanese land-based aircraft could reach the task force easily. Kamikaze attacks were constant, wave after wave of suicide aircraft diving into American ships. The Japanese knew they couldn't win the war, but they could make the Americans pay in blood for every mile they advanced toward the home islands. On March 19, 1945, at 07:08 hours in the morning, Missouri was screening carriers approximately 50 miles southeast of Kyushu when disaster struck USS Franklin. Franklin, a fleet carrier designated CV-13, was conducting flight operations in preparation for strikes against Japanese airfields on Kyushu. Aircraft were spotted on the flight deck, being armed with bombs and fueled for the morning mission. This was the most dangerous moment in carrier operations. Bombs armed and ready to drop, fuel lines full of aviation gasoline, aircraft packed together wing to maximize the number that could launch simultaneously. The American Combat Air Patrol had been aloft since dawn, trying to intercept Japanese aircraft before they reached the task force. Most attackers were shot down by Hellcat fighters patrolling at altitude or by the massive fleet anti-aircraft fire from dozens of ships. But some Japanese aircraft penetrated the defenses through luck, skill, superior tactics, or simple overwhelming numbers. On this morning, a single Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, piloted by an experienced Japanese naval aviator, broke through the combat air patrol by approaching from high altitude using cloud cover to mask his approach. The Japanese pilot knew exactly where to aim. The most vulnerable point on any aircraft carrier is the flight deck when aircraft are being launched or recovered. The Judy dove vertically through anti-aircraft fire from a dozen ships. Franklin's gunners tracked it, their 5-inch and 40mm guns following the diving bomber through the sky. Missouri's gunners tracked it, training their weapons on the target. Every ship in visual range opened fire. 5-inch guns firing proximity fused shells that exploded near the target, sending shrapnel through the air. 40mm quads pumping out explosive rounds at 800 rounds per minute. 20mm cannon firing solid shot tracer rounds. The sky filled with tracers and detonations, a curtain of steel that should have destroyed any aircraft attempting to penetrate. But the Japanese pilot held his course through the storm of steel. The Judy hit Franklin's flight deck at 07:08 hours. The aircraft and its bombs detonated on the flight deck, penetrating through the wooden planking to the hangar deck below where 31 fully armed and fueled aircraft were staged for the next launch. The initial explosion ignited thousands of gallons of aviation fuel. The fire spread instantly to armed bombs and torpedoes stored in the hangar deck. Secondary explosions ripped through the hangar deck as bombs detonated. Tertiary explosions followed as ready ammunition for the aircraft's guns cooked off in the heat. Within minutes, Franklin was transformed into a floating inferno, her entire midsection engulfed in flames and exploding ordnance that could be seen for miles. 807 men died on Franklin that morning. Hundreds more were wounded, burned, or blown overboard by the explosions. Damage control parties fought the fires for 5 hours, battling flames that reached temperatures hot enough to melt steel deck plating. They controlled the flooding from ruptured fire mains and seawater used to fight the fires. They stabilized a 30-degree list that threatened to capsize the ship and send her to the bottom with all hands. Through extraordinary courage, skill, and determination, they kept Franklin afloat. Many damage control personnel died in the effort, overcome by heat and smoke or killed by secondary explosions. Franklin survived but never returned to combat. She limped back to Pearl Harbor, listing 30 degrees with her flight deck twisted, her hull buckled, and massive holes blown through multiple decks. 807 dead. As many casualties as some infantry battalions suffered in weeks of combat on Pacific Islands. 1 aircraft, 1 hit, 1 bomb load. Missouri's anti-aircraft guns had tracked the dive bomber during its approach and attack run. The gun crews opened fire with everything that could reach the target. 5-inch guns, 40mm guns, 20mm guns. Every weapon that could elevate high enough and traverse fast enough. Missouri's gunners fired hundreds of rounds at the Judy during its dive. All of them missed. The Japanese pilot flew through Missouri's defensive fire and hit his target perfectly, demonstrating that even the most advanced anti-aircraft systems of 1945 couldn't guarantee protection against a skilled and determined attacker. That was the reality of Missouri's combat experience. Watching other ships get hit, firing thousands of rounds with minimal effect. It wasn't cowardice. The crew performed their duties professionally, but performance and effectiveness are different measures. Missouri's crew did what they were trained to do, but they couldn't stop the attack that devastated Franklin. Missouri's official combat record was documented in Navy archives. 3 battle stars for World War II service. Battle stars were awarded for participation in designated campaigns and operations. Iwo Jima was 1 star. Okinawa was 1 star. Operations against the Japanese home islands was 1 star, 3 total. Compare those 3 stars to other battleships in the Pacific Fleet. North Carolina earned 12 battle stars. South Dakota earned 13 battle stars. Alabama earned 9 battle stars. Washington earned 13 battle stars. Even the old battleships damaged at Pearl Harbor, ships that had been sunk, refloated, rebuilt, and returned to action, had comparable or better records than Missouri. West Virginia earned 5 battle stars, including participation at Surigao Strait, the last battleship engagement in history. Tennessee earned 10 battle stars. Maryland earned 7 battle stars. California earned 7 battle stars. Missouri had 3. The numbers told the story more clearly than any analysis could. Missouri participated in 3 major operations during her 8 months of World War II combat. Other battleships participated in 7, 9, 12, 13 separate operations over 2, 3, or 4 years of continuous combat. Missouri fought for 8 months. Other battleships fought for the entire war from Pearl Harbor to Japan's surrender, enduring years of dangerous operations in hostile waters. Missouri fired her main battery at shore targets on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the Japanese home islands. Shore bombardment missions, targets that couldn't maneuver or shoot back with equivalent weapons. Japanese coastal gun batteries were dangerous to landing craft and troops, but they had nothing that could threaten a battleship operating at 15,000 yards offshore. Missouri could sit beyond the range of coastal artillery and methodically destroy anything the Japanese positioned on the beaches or inland positions visible from the sea. Her 16-inch guns were devastating against fortifications. Each shell carried explosive power equivalent to a massive aerial bomb. The shells could penetrate thick concrete, destroy bunkers, collapse tunnels, and create massive craters. Marines assaulting fortified positions needed this kind of fire support to survive the initial landing phases. Shore bombardment saved lives by destroying defenses before troops went ashore. But shore bombardment wasn't combat in the sense that naval officers understood the term when they evaluated battleship effectiveness. It was artillery support, important work, necessary work. Marines assaulting fortified islands absolutely needed heavy guns to suppress enemy defenses and destroy fortifications. But shore bombardment wasn't the mission. Battleships were originally designed to perform. They were designed to fight other battleships in gun duels, to protect carriers from surface threats, to project naval power against enemy fleets. Shore bombardment was a secondary mission that became primary when enemy fleets no longer existed. On April 11, 1945, a Japanese Zero fighter broke through the combat air patrol and dove toward Missouri in a kamikaze attack. The pilot was probably already dead or dying, witnesses later reported. The aircraft was smoking and trailing fire, suggesting it had been hit by anti-aircraft fire during its approach, but retained enough momentum to continue toward its target. Missouri's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire with every gun that could train on the diving aircraft. 40mm Bofors quads firing explosive shells, 20mm Oerlikons firing solid shot, 5-inch dual-purpose guns firing proximity-fused shells. Thousands of rounds poured into the sky, creating a defensive umbrella that should have destroyed any attacking aircraft. The Zero kept coming through the defensive fire. The impact happened at 14:43 hours. The crew felt the ship shudder slightly as the aircraft struck. Damage control reports came immediately from the aft section. 1-0 crashed into the starboard side aft, below the main deck level near turret 3. Pilot dead on impact. Aircraft destroyed. Damage assessment: minimal. Minor dent in the armor belt. Some paint scraped off. No penetration of the armor. No fires. No casualties among the crew. That was Missouri's only hit by enemy action during World War II. One damaged kamikaze aircraft that couldn't penetrate the 12-inch armor belt. No American casualties. No significant damage to ship systems. No impact on combat capability. The ship's captain, William Callahan, made a remarkable decision. He ordered a full military funeral with honors for the Japanese pilot. The crew recovered what remained of the pilot's body, sewed it into a canvas shroud weighted with shell casings, and buried him at sea with a formal ceremony. It was a gesture of respect for an enemy warrior that became one of the most memorable moments from Missouri's combat service, demonstrating American values even toward those who had tried to kill them. What happened next would make Missouri the most famous battleship in American history. But it had nothing to do with combat effectiveness or military achievement. It had everything to do with politics, symbolism, public relations, and being in the right place at the right time when history needed a stage. The person who understood Missouri's publicity value wasn't a naval officer evaluating ships by their combat records. It was officials in Washington who understood politics and the power of symbols in shaping public perception. By July 1945, they were planning the formal end of World War II with careful attention to how the surrender ceremony would be remembered and what messages it would send to the world. The formal Japanese surrender would be the most photographed, most documented, most widely reported moment of the 20th century. The setting mattered enormously. The location would be remembered forever, studied by historians, shown in newsreels, reproduced in photographs that would appear in every newspaper and magazine in the world. The ceremony needed to happen on a warship that represented American naval power and military superiority. A battleship was the obvious choice, the ultimate symbol of naval strength, the biggest, most powerful, most visually impressive warship type, the perfect stage for accepting an enemy's unconditional surrender. But which battleship should host the ceremony? In July 1945, the decision-making process began. Multiple factors influenced the choice, but one consideration carried exceptional weight. Missouri was named after the home state of Harry Truman. Truman had been a senator from Missouri before becoming vice president. He became president on April 12, 1945, when Franklin Roosevelt died suddenly. Truman was the president who made the decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Truman was the commander-in-chief who would accept Japan's unconditional surrender and shape the post-war world. Choosing the battleship named after Truman's home state was perfect politics. It honored the president without being too obvious or sycophantic. It gave Truman a personal connection to the most important ceremony of his presidency. It associated his name and home state with the moment of victory, and it cost nothing in military terms. Missouri was available in the right location. Missouri was modern and impressive looking. Missouri would photograph well. The name had exactly the right political associations. The combat record didn't matter for this decision. Washington officials weren't evaluating ships by battle stars earned, or enemy ships sunk or months under fire. They were thinking about photographs and newsreels, about public relations and political messaging, about how history would remember this moment and what narratives would be constructed around it. Missouri was photogenic, large and impressive, well-maintained. The name had political value. That was enough. On August 2, 1945, the decision was formally made. USS Missouri would host the Japanese surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay. Orders went out through the chain of command. Missouri was designated as the official location for the signing of surrender documents. Over the next 3 weeks, Missouri's crew worked obsessively to prepare the ship for the most important day in her existence. Every inch of exposed steel was chipped to remove rust and corrosion, primed with rust-inhibiting paint, and repainted in proper navy haze grey. The teak decks were scrubbed with holystone until they were immaculate, every plank smooth and clean. The brass fittings throughout the ship were polished until they gleamed like gold. Gun barrels were cleaned and oiled. Equipment was inspected and tested. Missouri looked like a ship fresh from the builder's yard, instead of one that had spent 8 months at sea in combat zones. The ceremony happened on September 2nd, 1945, 09:02 hours, Tokyo Bay. Missouri was anchored in the bay surrounded by hundreds of Allied warships, a demonstration of the overwhelming force that had defeated Japan. The morning was overcast with occasional breaks in the clouds allowing shafts of sunlight to illuminate the scene. Missouri's veranda deck had been transformed for the occasion. A simple table had been set up, covered with green felt cloth. 2 copies of the surrender document sat on the table, one for the Allied powers to keep and one for Japan. Missouri's deck was crowded with witnesses to history, American generals and admirals in dress uniforms with rows of medals and ribbons. British representatives, led by Admiral Bruce Fraser, representing the Royal Navy. Chinese generals representing the forces that had fought Japan since 1937, Australian commanders. Dutch officers representing forces that had fought in the East Indies, French diplomats. Soviet representatives who had declared war on Japan only days earlier but wanted to participate in the victory. Hundreds of reporters from newspapers and wire services around the world. Photographers with speed graphic cameras loaded with film. Newsreel cameramen with Bell and Howell cameras cranking away, capturing every moment for audiences in movie theaters. Radio broadcasters describing the scene in real time for listeners worldwide. General Douglas MacArthur arrived to represent all Allied powers in accepting Japan's surrender. He had commanded American forces in the Southwest Pacific since the war began. He had retreated from the Philippines in 1942 under orders, leaving behind thousands of American and Filipino troops with his famous promise, "I shall return." He had returned in October 1944, wading ashore at Leyte with cameras recording the moment. Now, in September 1945, he stood on Missouri's deck as Supreme Commander to accept Japan's unconditional surrender and begin the occupation that would transform Japan from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy. Foreign, Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu arrived first representing the Japanese government. He walked with a cane due to injuries suffered years earlier in a bombing in Shanghai. He wore formal diplomatic dress, a top hat and morning coat, traditional attire for official state functions. Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu followed in military uniform, representing the Japanese armed forces. The Japanese delegation stood at attention on Missouri's deck, faces carefully controlled and impassive, preparing to sign documents that would end their nation's military ambitions, accept Allied occupation, and begin a new era. At 09:02 hours precisely, MacArthur stepped to the microphones and began the ceremony. His opening remarks were brief but powerful, carefully crafted for maximum impact. He spoke of peace, of hoping that a better world would emerge from the blood and carnage and suffering of war, of both victor and vanquished joining together to preserve the peace and build a future free from the devastation they had all endured. Then he invited the Japanese representatives to step forward and sign the surrender documents. Shigemitsu signed first at 09:04 hours, his hand shaking slightly as he affixed his signature to the document that ended Japan's existence as an independent military power. Umezu signed next, his face stern and controlled, showing no emotion as he signed away the armed forces he had commanded. Then MacArthur signed for the Allied powers, using multiple pens so he could distribute them as historic souvenirs. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz signed next, representing the United States and specifically the Navy and Marine forces that had fought across the Pacific. Admiral Bruce Fraser signed for the United Kingdom and British Commonwealth forces. Representatives of China, the Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, and New Zealand followed in order, each adding their signature to the historic document. The entire ceremony lasted 23 minutes, from 09:02 to 09:25, 23 minutes that would define Missouri's place in history forever and establish her reputation for the next 80 years. As the last signature was affixed to the surrender documents, hundreds of American aircraft from the surrounding carrier task forces flew over Missouri in tight formation, wave after wave of fighters and bombers, a dramatic demonstration of the air power that had ultimately defeated Japan. The drone of their engines provided an auditory punctuation mark to the ceremony, a reminder that American military power extended far beyond the ships in Tokyo Bay. The ceremony was broadcast live on radio networks around the world, reaching hundreds of millions of listeners. Newsreel cameras captured every moment from multiple angles, footage that would appear in movie theaters within days. Photographers took hundreds of pictures, images that would be published in every major newspaper and magazine. Reporters filed stories describing the scene in vivid detail. Missouri became instantly famous worldwide, more famous than any other battleship, more famous than the carriers that had actually won the war at sea through years of brutal combat. Missouri's fame came entirely from hosting a ceremony, not from combat achievement. But fame doesn't distinguish between different types of achievement or ask how recognition was earned. In public perception, hosting the surrender made Missouri important. Importance became legendary status. Legendary status became untouchable reputation. And that reputation, built in 23 minutes, would persist for decades, regardless of Missouri's actual combat record. The pattern established on September 2, 1945, would repeat throughout Missouri's subsequent career. Whenever the Navy needed a battleship for an important mission or public relations opportunity, Missouri was chosen first not because of superior capability, but because of her name recognition and symbolic importance. In June 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea and the United Nations authorized military intervention, the Navy needed battleships urgently. The Korean peninsula had long coastlines on both the Yellow Sea and the Sea of Japan. American and UN ground forces needed heavy naval gunfire support that only battleships could provide. Cruisers and destroyers had 5-inch guns adequate against troops and light fortifications, but only battleships had 16-inch guns capable of destroying heavily fortified bunkers, cave complexes carved into mountains, and reinforced concrete positions that could withstand anything smaller. The Iowa-class ships were the newest battleships in the reserve fleet and the best maintained. All four were theoretically available for reactivation. Missouri was chosen first, not because her systems were superior to her sisters, they weren't. Iowa, New Jersey, and Wisconsin had identical capabilities, identical weapons, identical fire control systems, but Missouri was famous. Missouri was the surrender ship. The political and public relations benefit of sending Missouri back into combat of demonstrating that the ship where Japan surrendered was now fighting communist aggression in Asia, was considered more valuable than purely tactical considerations. Missouri was reactivated and recommissioned on January 30, 1951. She underwent modernization to replace obsolete equipment and train a new crew. She departed for Korean waters in March 1952 and conducted shore bombardment missions along both coasts until March 1953. She fired her 16-inch guns at North Korean and Chinese positions threatening UN forces, bombarded the ports of Wonsan, Hungnam, Chongjin, and Hamhung, destroyed artillery positions that were shelling UN troops, provided fire support for amphibious operations and ground advances. Her guns were effective, and her crew professional. Missouri served 7 months in Korean combat waters. Effective service, professional service, important contributions to the war effort, but her sisters performed equally well with less public attention. Iowa served in Korea from April to October 1952, conducting similar missions with similar effectiveness. New Jersey served longer than Missouri, 2 separate deployments from May to November 1951, and then November 1952 to July 1953. Wisconsin served 2 tours conducting shore bombardment. All 4 Iowa-class battleships performed equally well in Korea. All provided equally effective fire support to ground forces. All accomplished their missions professionally. But Missouri received disproportionate press coverage because she was the famous surrender ship, even though her actual performance was identical to her sisters. In December 1984, Missouri was reactivated again as part of President Ronald Reagan's 600-ship Navy plan. Reagan had campaigned on rebuilding American military power after what he characterized as a decade of neglect following Vietnam. The Soviet Union was expanding its navy with new classes of warships, including the impressive Kirov-class battlecruisers. These were massive ships displacing 28,000 tons, armed with long-range cruise missiles and nuclear powered for unlimited range. Reagan wanted to demonstrate that America could match Soviet naval expansion and maintain superiority. Reactivating Iowa-class battleships made strategic and economic sense. The ships existed in reserve fleets on both coasts. They were in relatively good material condition despite years of inactivity. Modernization was expensive, requiring new weapon systems and electronics, but far cheaper than designing and building new capital ships from scratch. Most importantly, from a political perspective, battleships sent a powerful psychological message. These were the largest, most visible symbols of American naval power. Their return to active service would be noticed by allies and adversaries alike, demonstrating American resolve and capability. 4 Iowa-class battleships were reactivated between 1982 and 1988, Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin. Each underwent extensive modernization that transformed them into modern weapons platforms. The old World War II-era 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns were removed as obsolete in the missile age. Tomahawk cruise missile launchers were installed in armored box launchers, giving each battleship the ability to launch 32 land attack cruise missiles at targets hundreds of miles inland. Harpoon anti-ship missiles were added for surface warfare. Phalanx Close in weapon systems provided last-ditch missile defense. Modern radar systems replaced World War II-era equipment. Satellite communications and data links connected the battleships to the global command network. The modernized battleships were functionally identical in capability. Same weapons, same electronics, same combat systems, same mission capabilities. But Missouri received special treatment from the beginning. Her reactivation received more press coverage than her sisters. Her recommissioning ceremony on May 10, 1986 in San Francisco drew an estimated 10,000 spectators and extensive media coverage from national networks. Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger gave the keynote address at the ceremony, explicitly linking Missouri's World War II service and the surrender ceremony to her new role confronting the Soviet Union in the Cold War. In January 1991, during Operation Desert Storm against Iraq, Missouri and Wisconsin were deployed to the Persian Gulf. They provided naval gunfire support against Iraqi positions in Kuwait and launched Tomahawk cruise missiles against strategic targets in Katy, Iraq. Both ships performed their missions effectively and professionally. Missouri fired 783 16-inch shells during the campaign, destroying Iraqi artillery positions, command bunkers, and troop concentrations. She launched 28 Tomahawk cruise missiles at targets in Iraq, contributing to the air campaign that preceded the ground offensive. Wisconsin fired a similar number of shells and missiles with equal effectiveness. Both battleships accomplished their missions successfully, but news coverage focused disproportionately on Missouri. Network television reporters called her the most powerful battleship in the world, ignoring that Missouri and Wisconsin had identical capabilities. Newspapers ran stories emphasizing Missouri's service at the surrender ceremony 46 years earlier, drawing connections between World War II and Desert Storm. The pattern established in 1945 continued in 1991. Missouri received attention far beyond her actual military contribution simply because she was famous. The real battleship heroes of World War II were ships that fought when the outcome was genuinely uncertain, when American survival in the Pacific was at stake, when every engagement could determine whether the United States would hold its positions or be driven back across the Pacific. North Carolina at Guadalcanal in 1942, when a few thousand Marines were desperately holding a single airfield against Japanese attempts to recapture it, when Japanese naval superiority was crushing American efforts to maintain supply lines. Washington at the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, when one American battleship faced a Japanese force that should have overwhelmed her but was defeated through superior radar and crew performance. South Dakota at the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942, damaged by Japanese shells but continuing to fight, protecting carriers when America was losing the Pacific War and couldn't afford to lose ships or men. These ships fought when defeat was possible, when the Japanese Navy was strong and aggressive, when American forces were outnumbered and outgunned in many engagements. They earned their battle stars through actual combat against capable opponents who could shoot back effectively. They protected carriers during desperate battles. They fought surface actions at night. They absorbed damage and kept fighting. They did everything battleships were designed to do under the worst possible circumstances. Missouri arrived in January 1945 when the war was effectively won, when Japanese naval power was destroyed beyond recovery, when American air superiority was absolute and unchallenged, when the outcome was inevitable and only the timeline remained uncertain. Missouri's combat role was escort duty protecting carriers that faced minimal threats and shore bombardment against targets that couldn't effectively fight back. Essential work that needed to be done, necessary contributions to the final campaigns, but not the work that tested battleships under maximum pressure against equivalent opponents. Not the combat that separated truly great battleships from merely adequate ones. The three sister ships of the Iowa class all had objectively better combat records than Missouri, but would always be overshadowed by her fame. Iowa earned 11 battle stars for World War II service through longer deployment and participation in more campaigns. New Jersey earned 9 battle stars through the longest combat deployment of any Iowa-class ship. Wisconsin earned 5 battle stars through effective service in multiple operations. Missouri earned 3 battle stars for 8 months of combat operations. But Missouri's fame, earned not through combat but through hosting a ceremony for 23 minutes on September 2, 1945, made her more famous than all her sisters, combined and more famous than ships with far superior combat records. North Carolina became a museum ship in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1962. The ship was saved from scrapping through a massive public fundraising campaign led by citizens who recognized her historic importance. She deserved preservation. 12 battle stars, the only American battleship torpedoed at sea who returned to action within 3 months, present at every major Pacific campaign from Guadalcanal through Okinawa. 2 years of continuous combat operations. A genuine combat record earned through years of dangerous service. Washington was scrapped in 1961. The battleship that had sunk the enemy battleship Kirishima in surface combat, that had proven American battleships could dominate night actions through superior radar and training, was cut up for scrap steel. Her combat achievements were forgotten. Nobody organized campaigns to save her. She wasn't famous enough to generate public support for preservation. Iowa became a museum ship in Los Angeles. New Jersey became a museum in Camden, New Jersey. Wisconsin became a museum in Norfolk, Virginia. All three served longer in combat than Missouri, fought in more campaigns, earned more battle stars, faced more dangerous opposition. All contributed more to winning the Pacific War through actual combat operations. Missouri became a museum in Pearl Harbor in 1999. The location was perfect for symbolic purposes. 500 yards from the USS Arizona Memorial. Arizona represented the beginning of America's Pacific War, the surprise attack that brought the United States into World War II. Missouri represented the end, the formal surrender that concluded the war. The symbolism was powerful and historically resonant, except the symbolism was based on circumstance rather than combat achievement. Missouri didn't represent the end of the Pacific War through her combat accomplishments. She represented the end because political officials chose her as the site for a ceremony based on her name and its connection to President Truman. The truth about Missouri's combat record was always available in official Navy records accessible to anyone who wanted to look. 3 battle stars, 8 months of combat operations, no enemy warships sunk, no major surface engagements. These facts were never classified or hidden. They appeared in Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships entries, in official Navy histories, in unit records maintained by the National Archives. But most Americans never looked up these details. They saw photographs of the surrender ceremony. They read magazine articles and books calling Missouri the greatest American battleship. They watched documentaries that focused on the ceremony rather than combat records. They assumed Missouri must have earned her fame and reputation through exceptional combat performance rather than through political convenience and symbolic importance. Missouri became and remains the most famous American battleship of World War II. That fact is indisputable. The surrender ceremony, the museum preservation in Pearl Harbor, the countless books and documentaries and magazine articles, the public recognition and name awareness, all of this made Missouri more famous than any other capital ship in American naval history. But if you evaluate battleships by objective measures of combat effectiveness, by the actual battles they fought and won, by the enemy ships they destroyed, by the carriers they protected through years of dangerous operations, by the months and years spent in hostile waters facing capable enemies who could fight back, by the damage they absorbed and the losses they prevented, Missouri was one of the least distinguished modern American battleships of World War II. Her combat record places her near the bottom when compared to other fast battleships that served in the Pacific. Only USS Indiana, which spent most of the war in training and secondary roles, had a less impressive combat record among modern battleships. The surrender ceremony was historically significant, symbolically powerful, and politically important. It marked the formal end of the most destructive war in human history. It deserved to be remembered and commemorated. But hosting that ceremony for 23 minutes didn't make Missouri a great combat battleship. It made her a famous battleship chosen for political reasons to serve as a stage for a historic moment. Understanding the difference between fame earned through circumstance and greatness earned through years of combat achievement is essential to understanding what actually happened in the Pacific War, which ships truly carried the burden of fighting when the outcome was uncertain, and which vessels genuinely deserve to be remembered as the most effective fighting ships of their era.